Pastoureau argues that color is not only a physical and perceptual phenomenon, but also a complex cultural construct that resists generalization and analysis, posing many difficult questions. This is undoubtedly the reason why works dedicated to color are rarely found in medieval studies, and even more rarely are there studies that are well balanced and justified, exploring the subject from a genuine historical perspective. Some authors prefer to freely manipulate time and space in an attempt to derive so-called universal and archetypical truths about color. The historian does not accept such claims. Color is primarily a social fact. Color does not have any transcultural meaning, despite attempts to convince us otherwise by certain books relying on poorly digested neurobiological knowledge or subpar psychology. Archaeologists, art historians, and researchers of everyday life are in part responsible for this situation because they rarely discuss color. However, their silence is caused by several reasons, which are historical evidence in themselves. These reasons are mainly related to the difficulties encountered when considering color as an object of historical study in the full sense. There are three main types of these difficulties: source-related, methodological, and epistemological. The first difficulty stems from the variety of color carriers and the state in which they have survived to us. Before studying these carriers, a historian must always remember that what has reached us through the centuries is not in its original state, but has transformed over time. The influence of time itself is a historical fact, whether it is the chemical changes in pigments or the impact of humans who have painted, repainted, altered, cleaned, varnished, or removed layers of paint added by previous generations. Time leaves its mark. That's why I am always genuinely perplexed when I hear about laboratory projects where advanced technical tools are used to restore the colors of monuments or works of art, or, even worse, to restore them to their original state. This reflects scientific positivism, which seems to me both useless and dangerous, contradicting the historian's task. The influence of time is an integral part of historical, archaeological, or art historical research, so why deny it? Historical reality is not only the original state, but also its change over time. Regarding color, this should never be overlooked. The fading of colors, as well as the repainting done by each generation, each century, and each era, must be taken into account. We must also remember that today we observe objects and colors under lighting that is very different, not only from the lighting familiar to medieval society, but also from the light conditions that existed before the invention of the electric bulb. Torches, oil lamps, salt lamps, wax, or stearin candles produce light completely different from electricity. Do historians studying images, artistic expressions, or monuments take this into account? If they do not, they may end up with absurd conclusions. For example, let us recall the recent restoration of the vaults in the Sistine Chapel and the enormous efforts, both technical and media-related, made to restore the original purity and freshness of the paints applied by Michelangelo's brush. Such an endeavor, despite all the hype surrounding it, is undoubtedly interesting. However, it turns into a complete anachronism as soon as we begin to consider and study the colors obtained in this way under electric lighting. What, in reality, remains of Michelangelo's colors under today's lighting? Does it not deceive us even more than the gradual changes brought about by time and human efforts between the 16th and 19th centuries? One can imagine medieval monuments that would be destroyed or irreparably damaged if they were exposed to modern landmarks, and such an undertaking would seem downright criminal. The desperate search for so-called historical or archaeological truth sometimes ends in a real catastrophe. Finally, continuing the discussion of the difficulties of source-related nature, it is important to emphasize that since the 16th century, historians and archaeologists have mostly worked with black and white images, first with prints and engravings, and later with photographs. For about 4 centuries, black and white documents were practically the only sources available for studying the visual monuments of the past, including paintings. In this way, historians and art historians, in a sense, began to see and think in black and white terms, thus reinforcing the gap between the black and white reality and the colorful one, a gap that never existed in antiquity or the Middle Ages. While working with sources, books, magazines, and iconographies where black and white images dominate, historians and art historians have, until very recently, interpreted and studied the Middle Ages either as a world of gray, black, and white colors, or as a world in which color was entirely absent. The recent return to black photography has not changed the situation significantly, at least not so far. On the one hand, thought patterns are too deeply rooted to change in just a few decades, and on the other hand, access to color photographic documents has been, and still is, a luxury. Art books are expensive, color films cost a fortune, and image databases often distort colors, especially red, green, and most of all, gold tones. And we know how crucial the issue of gold color is for studying medieval art. Creating a standard slide in a museum, library, exhibition, or archive is a challenging task for a researcher. Barriers pile up from all sides, and the only options left are to either retreat or go bankrupt. The conditions are such that it is almost impossible to access not only the original work or source, but even its color reproduction. Furthermore, for entirely understandable financial reasons, publishers and editors of academic journals often try to limit the number of color illustrations in their publications or even avoid them altogether. Working with color has become a luxury that is out of reach for most researchers in the humanities. The gap between the latest technological advancements in image processing, digitization, long-distance transmission, and computer analysis, and the everyday grassroots labor of a historian who faces various obstacles in studying visual documents of the past, continues to widen. On one hand, we have all the achievements of 20th century science at our disposal. On the other, financial, institutional, and legal barriers often remain simply insurmountable. These are not just interesting details. These observations have important historiographical significance and primarily relate to the current situation in art history. Due to the complexity caused by the state of sources, as well as legal and financial factors, researchers often prefer not to engage with color and instead focus on other aspects. The second group of difficulties is methodological. When trying to understand the status and functioning mechanism of color in an image, artwork, or example, a medieval historian almost always finds themselves disoriented. Indeed, as soon as color comes into play, a multitude of questions arises regarding the material, technique, chemical composition, and properties of the dye, iconography, artistic, and symbolic meaning. How should one approach this? What questions should be asked, and in what order? To date, no scholar or research group has proposed an adequate analytical approach, or set of approaches, that the entire academic community could adopt. This is why, unable to handle the vast number of problems and parameters, a researcher often tends to focus only on what fits within the system of their evidence, discarding anything that disrupts it. Of course, this is not the proper way to work, though we all sometimes fall into this trap. Moreover, medieval sources, whether written or visual, are never ambiguous or neutral. Each source has its own specificity and interprets reality in its own way. Like any other historian, a color specialist must take this into account and recognize that each type of source has its own rules for encoding and functioning. Texts and images, in general, belong to different discourses and must be studied and analyzed using different methods. This obvious truth is often forgotten, especially by iconographers and art historians, who, instead of deciphering the meaning of the images themselves, overlay them with interpretations from other sources, particularly from texts. Medievalists could sometimes learn from researchers of prehistoric periods who work with images, such as cave paintings, without a single accompanying text. They are forced to make hypotheses, search for clues, and decipher meaning by analyzing the images themselves, not by projecting information gathered from texts onto them. Art historians and historians could certainly adopt their method, at least during the initial stages of analysis. The priority of the source, whether it is a panel, stained glass, tapestry, miniature, wall painting, or mosaic, is an unquestionable requirement. Before formulating hypotheses or offering generalized interpretations based on diverse sources about the symbolism of colors, iconographic traditions, or conventional representations of reality, it is essential first to extract from the source itself all the information about color it can provide. This includes the connection with the material carrier, the surface occupied, the colors presented, and those that are absent. Absence, in this case, is itself a powerful historical source. The compositional significance of color, its distribution, and rhythmic techniques are also critical. External encoding is secondary. Color is primarily encoded within the image. The source itself encodes color for its own purposes. Only after analyzing the color internally, from the perspective of the source, step by step, can the researcher then consider color from other perspectives and move on to the next stages of analysis. Any interpretations that explain the presence of certain colors through textual influence, iconographic tradition, heraldic, emblematic, or symbolic function should only be used in the second stage of the research, once the colors have been analyzed from the standpoint of the internal structure of the studied object or image. This does not mean that such interpretations are less valid. They should simply be applied only in the second stage of analysis. However, one thing should be entirely avoided: seeking any form of realistic meaning for colors. A medieval image never photographs reality. It is not intended for that, neither in terms of form nor color. For example, assuming that a red garment in a 13th century miniature or 15th century stained glass represents a real garment that was actually red is simultaneously naive, anachronistic, and incorrect. Moreover, this is a gross methodological mistake. On any image, red clothing is red primarily because it is contrasted with clothing of other colors: blue, black, green, or another red. Clothing of another color may appear on the same image or in others, resonating or contrasting with the red. Color is never isolated. It gains meaning and significance only in combination with other colors, or in contrast to them. No medieval image reproduces reality with meticulous color accuracy. This is true for miniatures as well as for other artistic techniques. The same can be said for texts. Any written source reflects reality in a distorted and specific way. If a medieval chronicler tells us that the mantle of a king on such and such an occasion was blue, it does not mean it was actually blue, just as it does not mean the opposite. Such questions are meaningless. Any description, any mention of color is ideological, even when it appears in the most insignificant inventory list or in the most stereotypically material document. Even the mere fact of whether or not the color of an object is mentioned reflects a significant choice, full of economic, political, social, or symbolic meanings embedded within a very specific context. The choice of word used by a scribe or notary to express the essence, quality, and function of this color is equally significant. The third group of difficulties, if you still remember what we're discussing, is epistemological in nature. It is inadmissible to apply our modern definitions, methods of perception, and classifications of color directly to the images, monuments, works of art, and objects created in the Middle Ages. These do not fit the medieval context. The historian, especially a historian studying images and the visual arts, is constantly at risk of falling into anachronism. When it comes to color, its specific definitions and classifications, the danger increases even further. For example, let's recall that throughout the Middle Ages, black and white were considered colors in the full sense of the word, or even as the color poles for all color systems. The spectrum and spectral sequence of colors were not known until the discovery of Newton in the second half of the 17th century, and the interrelationship between primary and secondary colors began to be gradually established in the same 17th century, only becoming fully established in the 19th century. The opposition between warm and cool colors is entirely conventional and functions differently depending on the society or era. As we've already mentioned, in medieval Europe, blue was considered a warm color, and sometimes even the warmest color. Therefore, a historian of painting who wishes to analyze a panel, miniature, or stained glass in terms of the relationship between warm and cool colors, while assuming that blue was regarded as a cool color in the 13th or 14th century, just as it is today, would be misled. The concept of warm and cool primary and secondary colors, classifications based on the spectrum or color wheel, laws of perception, or simultaneous contrast, are not eternal truths, but merely stages in the historical development of knowledge. These classifications cannot be applied freely and thoughtlessly to ancient or medieval societies. Let's take a simple example and consider the specific case of the spectrum. After Newton's experiment, the discovery of the spectrum and spectral classification of colors seems undeniable to us, and we are convinced that green lies somewhere between yellow and blue. Various social habits, scientific calculations, natural evidence, and everyday practices at any moment remind or prove this to us. However, for a medieval person, this would make no sense. There is no medieval color system that places green between yellow and blue. The latter two colors belong to different scales, positioned on different axes. There can be no transitional intermediate between them, namely green. Green, of course, is closely related to blue, but it has no relation to yellow. Moreover, up until the 15th century, neither in painting nor in dyeing would we find any recipe for producing green by mixing yellow or blue. Artists and dyers, of course, knew how to make green paint, but they did not mix yellow with blue to do so, nor did they mix blue with red to create purple. Historians must be wary of any anachronistic conclusions. They should not project their own knowledge of the physics or chemistry of color onto the past, nor should they treat the spectral sequence of colors as an absolute, unchanging truth, along with any speculations that follow from it. Historians, like ethnologists, should consider the spectrum only as one of many systems of color classification. Today, this classification is known and accepted, scientifically proven by empirical means, but perhaps 2 or 3 centuries from now, it will seem ridiculous and be discarded. The concept of scientific proof is also culturally conditioned. It has its own history, foundations, and ideological and social purposes. Aristotle, who did not arrange colors in spectral order, nonetheless scientifically justified and proved the validity of his classification based on physical, optical, and even ontological perspectives, according to the knowledge available to him in the 4th century BCE. The explanation for how medieval people perceived color contrasts differently from modern humans lies in both cultural and perceptual factors. Even though the visual apparatus of a medieval person was biologically the same as ours, their perception of color contrasts was shaped by different aesthetic values, cultural meanings, and symbolic interpretations. A color combination that we now perceive as high contrast, like red and green, may have been considered less contrasting in the medieval period. This can be attributed to the way medieval color theory and symbolism were structured, where certain color pairings were used in a more nuanced or restrained way. For example, the combination of red and green, which frequently appeared in aristocratic costumes between the Carolingian period and the 12th century, would have had a softer contrast to the medieval eye. For us, however, it represents a stark opposition between primary and complementary colors, creating a much more jarring effect. On the other hand, combinations like yellow and green, which are adjacent on the modern color spectrum and are seen as relatively harmonious today, were perceived as much more striking and dissonant in medieval times, often signifying madness or dangerous, sinful behavior. This dissonance in color perception is also connected to the social and symbolic context. The perception of color was closely tied to rituals, religious practices, and social status. Only the vibrant, clear, and durable colors were valued, as these were associated with life, vitality, and the sacred. Colors that faded or lost their vibrancy were often considered lesser. The Church, as the central institution in medieval life, played a crucial role in color usage. Religious ceremonies, particularly by the 13th century, began to incorporate color not just as decoration, but as a key part of liturgy and spectacle. Colors used in vestments, church decor, stained glass, and liturgical books conveyed sacred meanings and became deeply symbolic, enhancing the spiritual experience of the Mass and other religious events. In this way, understanding the role of color in medieval life requires looking beyond modern perceptions and understanding the symbolic, ritualistic, and social layers that shaped how people of the time saw and used color in their world. Even though the influence of heraldry was vast, the most common carrier of color in everyday life was not coats of arms, but clothing. Contrary to the popular belief, all clothing in the Middle Ages was dyed, including that of the poorest social classes. However, not all dyes were the same. The clothing of the rich differed from that of the poor not because one was dyed and the other wasn't, or because of a specific color choice or fashion, but because of the durability, intensity, and shine of the colors. The rich and powerful wore clothing in bright colors. The dyes deeply penetrated the fibers of the fabric and didn't fade from the sun, washing, or time. The poor, on the other hand, wore clothing in faded grayish hues because it was dyed with cheaper, almost always plant-based pigments that stayed on the surface of the fabric and disappeared with environmental exposure. This was the most significant color distinction in medieval clothing practices. The rich and poor wore similar colors, but the rich wore vibrant ones while the poor wore dull ones. St. Louis, for example, liked to wear blue. He was the first king to make this a habit, especially during the second period of his reign. Around the middle of the 13th century, almost all the peasants in his kingdom also wore blue clothing. It was dyed using woad, a wild plant from the crucifer family that grew in many regions. However, these two shades of blue were not identical. One was vibrant, royal blue, while the other was faded and dull. To a person in the 12th century, these were completely different colors. And this is a crucial point. As soon as a historian trying to understand color perception compares various testimonies from language, social practices, economic activities, religious or civil morality, and fashion requirements, they will immediately notice that, from a medieval perspective, the bright, saturated blue had more in common with the similarly bright and saturated red, yellow, or green than with the dull, faded blue. However, clothing can be heraldic and emblematic, and certain colors can acquire meanings that reflect a person's identity, status, or rank. This role of color in clothing seems to have grown particularly under the influence of heraldry, starting from the 12th century, especially within the clergy. Within this taxonomic function, the color itself, as well as 2- and 3-color combinations, became significant. But the material qualities of color, whether bright or dull, intense or faded, solid or speckled, smooth or uneven, could also play an important deictic or classificatory role. A medieval person was so accustomed to judging the quality of substances and materials by sight, even without touching them, that they could assess any dyed fabric at first glance. Furthermore, starting from the 1140s, medieval clothing came under the influence of fashion and tastes, which often affected color. A fascinating event in this area was the almost revolutionary shift in the long-standing tradition, the triumph of blue shades in the clothing of all social classes. This blue revolution began in France in 1140, gained momentum in the second half of the 12th century, and by the following century had become widespread, including in the lands of the empire. This fact had great social and perceptual significance. It marked the establishment of a new color order in Western culture, a system that partly persists to this day. Blue, which had meant little to domestic societies that didn't greatly favor it, such as the Romans, had been in the shadows during the early Middle Ages. Yet, from the 1140s onwards, it suddenly invaded all forms of artistic expression, becoming the color of Christ and the Virgin Mary, later the color of kings and princes, and by the late 12th century, it even began to rival red in many areas of social life. The following century became a great age for the spread of blue, so much so that by 1300 it had replaced red and become the favorite color of Europeans. In fact, it largely remains so to this day. The spread of blue in clothing and textiles led to a reduction in the use of other colors, not so much red, with which it now had strong competition, but which remained highly sought after in clothing, as much as green, and especially yellow. After the 1200s, it became rare to find men and women, whether nobility or commoners, dressed in yellow in Western Europe. While some color combinations, starting from that time, became innocently popular, blue and white, red and white, black and white, and even red and blue, others lost favor. Yellow and red, yellow and green, red and black, and especially red and green, the most popular two-color combination in aristocratic clothing since the Carolingian era, fell out of favor. In this context, a historian may rightfully ask which colors were considered beautiful by men and women, and which were considered ugly. Unfortunately, answering this question is impossible, not only because researchers risk falling into the trap of anachronism, but also because, in attempting such an investigation, they would inevitably remain prisoners of language. Beauty and ugliness in medieval sources are primarily linguistic phenomena, and there can be a huge difference between the actual color of objects and beings, the color a person perceives, and the color that a given author describes. Additionally, it's important to acknowledge that a medieval historian never deals with individual views or tastes. They see everything through the eyes of others, and more importantly, through the eyes of the social system. Therefore, the assessment of a particular color, the judgment of whether a certain shade is beautiful or ugly, depends primarily on moral, religious, or social norms. Beautiful things were almost always considered to be what was appropriate, moderate, and familiar. Of course, there is a purely aesthetic pleasure in the contemplation of color, but it usually concerns natural colors. Only they are truly beautiful, pure, lawful, and harmonious. Nevertheless, despite the fact that we have inherited statements from poets, the historian is not sufficiently equipped to study this pure enjoyment of color. Here, too, they remain prisoners of words and literary devices, and their use does not define the nature of the study. However, the concepts of pleasure, harmony, and beauty during the Carolingian era, as well as in the 12th and 15th centuries, were far from what we consider them to be today. Even the perception of color combinations or contrasts, as we've already discussed, may differ from our own. Therefore, how should we judge the beauty or ugliness of the colors that the Middle Ages have left us? Not only can we not see them in their original state, but we also view them most often under lighting that is not like the lighting of the medieval era. Moreover, our eyes respond to completely different qualities, meanings, and combinations. Just as today, following some medieval authors, we can discern the light of brightness, the dullness of fading, and the smoothness of monotony. We tend to equate our own perceptions with those of the medieval people, even though they were not the same, and in fact, were quite different. How can we today feel what a medieval person felt when seeing the play of colors? If the color play occurs on one level, it is unpleasant to the eye, while the eye delights when it goes into depth, building upon several overlapping layers. This was how colors were perceived and evaluated in the Middle Ages, whereas from our perspective, there is no real difference between these two types of polychromy. The historian must always remember that no universal truth about color exists, neither in terms of definitions, practices, or meanings, nor in terms of perception. All of this is determined by culture, and more culture.